This is Lecture 3 for Haas 121 in Week 10, where we continue talking about psychosocial development in young adulthood and talk about attachment in adulthood. So this lecture is sort of a companion lecture to Week 4, where we talked about attachment theory and then attachment types and styles in Lecture 4.2. And also, it's sort of a companion to Week 6, where we talked about forming trust and attachment in Lecture 6.3. So we will revisit some of what we already talked about around implications of early childhood attachment for adult attachment and attachment styles. And then we'll go beyond this by talking about how adult attachment is measured, how adult attachment seems to manifest in terms of romantic relationship patterns, and also how a parent's attachment style relates to their infant's attachment style. And this lecture draws on material from the reader in Week 4 in addition to Week 10. You may recall this diagram from the reader and from the lectures in Week 4 about how secure attachment in infancy relates to relationship patterns in later stages of development after infancy. And so, this diagram suggests that secure attachment in infancy relates to good peer attachment or peer relationships in childhood. So we talked about that relationship in the middle childhood years. Relates to intimate friendships in adolescence, which we also touched on, and then relates to emotionally positive romantic relationships in early adulthood. And that's where we're at. So this research suggests that early attachment relationships and experiences do make a difference later in life, but I want to emphasize, as I did in Week 4, that early attachment styles can be modified. So the idea of resilience that we talked about in Week 2, you have to always keep in mind. So it's not just destiny, but it tends to be if people don't look at their attachment relationships and if they had some issues in terms of those early experiences, they tend to stay in the same pattern. But people can change, especially if they're intentional about it. And a lot of psychotherapy, for those of you who are considering to be therapists who are studying psychology or social work, a lot of psychotherapy is about changing, becoming aware of patterns and changing patterns, including attachment patterns. So going back to attachment theory, you may recall from Week 4 that we talked about Harry Harlow and his research experiments with infant rhesus monkeys as being important contribution to attachment theory. So in his experiment, he removed infant rhesus monkeys from their mothers shortly after birth and raised them instead with surrogate mothers and gave them sort of wire and mothers that would feed them and wood ones that were covered with cloth. And these experiments showed that the monkeys would cling to and preferred the cloth monkey, as this one is here in this photo. And it wasn't just the relationship between the sort of mother, quote unquote, the surrogate mother and the infant monkey wasn't just about feeding, it was about contact comfort, that infants, primates like we are, like this rhesus monkey, are seeking contact comfort. And that's one of the critical ideas that led to the formation of attachment theory around the idea of a secure base and a safe haven, someone who provides that warmth and closeness and that gives that kind of psychological sense of comfort. There's more to that story that I didn't share with you in Week 4 about what happened when the monkeys that were separated from their mothers were adults themselves. And so there's a lot of interesting detail to the research of Harry Harlow. Today we would not consider the research to be ethical because it was harming, to the rhesus monkeys that were involved. But it's given us some valuable information about how primates function. He showed basically, when he continued this experiment, the monkeys that were raised by the dummy mothers engaged in strange behavioral patterns when they were adults. They would have excessive aggression, when they were reintroduced to other monkeys. They didn't know how to engage in normal sexual behaviors when they were put back with other monkeys, so they were not really able to mate. So the females that were isolated, didn't have monkeys to raise them, typically ignored the males that would approach them, while isolated males would make inefficient attempts to mate with females. So they just didn't know what to do in terms of mating. And also, but then Harlow sort of took his experiment, and he made sure that the mothers that were isolated were impregnated, and then observed how these mothers parented. And the isolated female monkeys, he called them the motherless mothers, were either negligent or abusive. So the negligent mothers didn't nurse their babies, they didn't try to comfort or protect their young, but they didn't try to harm them. The abusive monkeys would actually violently bite or injure the babies to the point where many of them died. So this research suggested that this deprivation of emotional bonds to a live mother monkey in infancy meant that these adult monkeys were unable to create secure attachment with their own offspring. And so again, it suggested the importance of mother-child bonding, and that bonding in early life led to the ability to have positive peer relationships, to be able to mate and have romantic relationships, and then to be able to parent one's own offspring. His research really showed there was a connection for the primates that he studied. And Mary Ainsworth, who's another name that you might remember from week 4, who formulated the strange situation as a way of, in a laboratory setting, testing attachment types in infancy. She talked about also adult attachment relationships and what those might look like in terms of how adult relationships can function as an attachment relationship for an adult. So she talked about adults, that a secure attachment for an adult would facilitate functioning and competence for that adult outside of that relationship. So an adult would seek to have security and comfort in their relationship with their romantic partner, their committed romantic partnership, and that the security and the comfort from that relationship would enable the adult to move off from the secure base and explore and engage in other activities. So Ainsworth believed that like the mother figure or the attachment figure in early childhood provides a secure base for a child to go off and explore and do child's work, which is play. In adulthood, a romantic partner, an intimate partner where there's a committed relationship, that enables an adult to go off and do what they need to do in the world, knowing they have a source, a secure base and a safe haven, someone who can provide that comfort and reassurance. You may recall this table as well from week 4, and it's also in your reader on page 144, that describes attachment styles in adulthood and how those relate to attachment types in early childhood, and the internal working model, which is about how a person sees the self, themselves, and sees the other in a positive or negative way. So what we're going to do in this lecture is unpack this a little bit more in terms of what these different attachment styles in adulthood tend to look like, according to research, in terms of how they manifest, particularly in romantic relationships. And first I'll mention that the way that attachment is measured for adults. So for adults, we don't put adults through a strange situation like we do with young children. It's measured differently. And if you're interested in mental health, so if you're studying to be a social worker or a psychologist, you may find that you'll end up doing something like these, use these methods to measure adults' attachment in your professional practice. It's not described very much in your reading, so you don't need to worry too much about the details. I'm just telling you about this to let you learn about it. But don't stress too much. I'm not going to test you about how adult attachment is measured on the final exam, because it's not in your readings. But I think it's an interesting thing for you to know about, because it's important, and it's a kind of juxtaposition to the strange situation that we talked about for infants. So first of all, there's different ways of doing it. There are interview approaches, and then there's self-report. And we've talked about, in week 2, we talked about different methods of getting data from people. I'm going to describe the interview approach in more detail, But the self-report approach would be like using a questionnaire and having people fill in their response to questions. And then the interview approach that's typically used is called the adult attachment interview. And there can also be clinical interviews that are used by psychotherapists. But the questions and the issues that really come up around how do you assess attachment for adults, when you're trying to do that, people are trying to get to what is the person's attitudes about their relationships with their parents and with their romantic relationships. Can the person make a kind of recognition of what happened in their past, and have they resolved issues from their childhood? So in terms of measuring adult attachment, the adult attachment interview that I'm going to talk about in more detail is considered to be the gold standard by many people, because it's able to tap into not just what people say, but actually the way they express it. And so what comes out is the unconscious, which Freud would say is really formed in early childhood and relates to the attachment relationship. But the problems are that it's long, it's difficult to use, and you have to be specially trained. So often adult attachment will be used using self-report measures, questionnaires that people can fill in, and that's a way that you can get large samples, and you can sort of send a survey out to lots of people. But the question is, are you really measuring attachment, or just what people think you want to hear, or something else? So ideally, attachment in adulthood is measured using the adult attachment interview, but it's not always practical. The adult attachment interview basically has a series of questions that asks the person about their early attachment history. So it begins with the question, I'd like you to try to describe your relationship with your parents as a young child, if you could start from as far back as you can remember. And that varies a lot for people. Some people have a lot of trouble remembering their early childhood, but people are instructed to think back as early as they can. And the idea is to measure the person's, who may be an adolescent, maybe an adult, their state of mind with respect to the attachment, the way that they are currently representing that relationship from early childhood. So it doesn't have to be, kind of quote unquote accurate about what happened back then. It's about how someone interprets and still thinks about that relationship in the present day. But the questions are designed in a way where to surprise the unconscious. So the idea is really to look at what's going on for the person and study their response and how they respond in addition to the actual words they use. And it's considered to be the gold standard, or really high, the best thing you can do around adult attachment, in part because when it's been used to measure someone's attachment style in adulthood, there tends to be a high correlation between the adult and his or her own infant when they're measured later, in terms of how that an infant's attachment type. So we'll talk about that, but there tends to be a very high overlap between a parent's attachment experience and the attachment experience they have with their own child. Not 100%, but very high. So when someone is conducting an adult attachment interview, they are looking for, as I said, the way that the person describes that relationship, and the way that it's often a psychologist, it's a clinical person who's doing the interview. It's often done in the context of therapy, and they're looking about the way that people are talking about their past experience. Do they seem to have clear memories? Are they giving memory lapses? Are they minimizing negative aspects? Are they contradicting themselves? Are they idealizing? Are they over preoccupied? Are they unresolved? Do they even show disassociation, where they are not speaking in a way that is logical or reasonable? So all of those things, that's actually what someone will look at when they're conducting an adult attachment interview, and then trying to score it to determine what is the adult attachment style that is being shown overall in the way that this person is describing that relationship. So again, there's these different patterns that are related to having different attachment styles in adulthood that are likely to correspond with the early childhood attachment type. So I'm now going to go into a little bit more detail about the research that looks at adult attachment styles, which would presumably come from early childhood but can be changed, and patterns in romantic relationships. Now, there's not much of this in your reading, so again, you won't be tested on this for your final. So I may lose some of you here, but if for your own interest, if you want to continue listening, I think it's interesting in terms of the light it casts on this aspect, this theme of our class around attachment. So I'll continue describing some of the research that comes from this particular source, which is a chapter that talks about the dynamics of adult romantic relationships and attachment. So again, once you've measured adult attachment, preferably using the adult attachment interview, there's some research on these 4 different adult attachment styles. First, secure, which relates to the early childhood type of secure attachment. And secure adults are those who have mastered the complexities of close relationships sufficiently well to let them explore and play without needing to keep a vigilant watch of the attachment figure. So that's that kind of security that's expressed in the idea of secure base and safe haven. People feel like they've got a psychological comfort that that person is there for them, and so they don't need to protect themselves emotionally, put down some armor from the attachment figures. So for the research patterns that are observed in adults that are assessed to be secure, these are some of the characteristics of those adults' relationship patterns. So tend to be highly invested in relationships, tend to have long and stable relationships, characterized by trust and friendship, able to seek support when under stress, responsive to support themselves, empathetic and supportive to others, flexible, and have high self-esteem. So there's some of these overlap you may see with like the second lecture for week 10 around successful relationships. So secure adults tend to be able to have that kind of emotional intimacy, which is, according to Sternberg's triangular theory, is one of the characteristics of successful romantic relationships. And they also have these qualities of empathy and support, again, which is around emotional intimacy. So the adult attachment style preoccupied relates to the early childhood attachment type of insecure, ambivalent, or resistant. So you remember that these are the children where a parent is not consistently available, or maybe kind of hot and cold in terms of the response to the child. So, where there's been a pattern of trying to keep track of or hold of that unreliable caregiver during infancy is associated with a style in adulthood where there's an attempt to hold on to partners, but done in a way that can be unsuccessful, can backfire, and can result in negative feelings like anger and insecurity. So recall that the preoccupied adult pattern from the diagram earlier in this lecture and in your reader has the internal working model where there's a positive view of the other and a negative view of self. And that is associated with these patterns in adulthood around being obsessed with romantic partners, and being intrusive and controlling, but suffering from jealousy, worrying about rejection. That's, again, that negative view of self, and a pattern of instability in terms of breaking up and getting back together. So the adult attachment style of dismissing is associated with the early childhood attachment type of insecure avoidant. And this is where there's a parenting style that is rejecting or intrusive. So, the child kind of shuts off in terms of trying to get contact with the caregiver. So what begins as this attempt to try to regulate the attachment behaviors, the primary caregiver who's not providing contact or comfort or soothing, either because they're doing it in a way that's intrusive and not sensitive, or they're rejecting, becomes in the adult a defensiveness, a self-reliance that's to the extreme, where there can be a coolness and a distance in relationship with partners, as well as with other important relationships like friendships. So the dismissing style in adulthood is associated, again, if you remember, with the internal working model, where there's a negative view of the other, but a positive view of self. So that manifests where there's not so much investment maybe in a romantic partner, and a higher breakup rate that you might see with the preoccupied, where there's a real obsession with the other and positive feelings towards the other. The dismissing adult may feel lonely, but may externally grieve less after a breakup, and that's just like in early childhood. There's actually distress in the avoidant attachment style, but it's not. They don't necessarily show it around the attachment figure, the adult. There may be a pattern of withdrawing when someone feels emotional distress, or coping by ignoring or denying problems, and there can also be a pattern around being critical of the other, of the partner's needs. And then the fourth attachment style in adulthood and in early childhood is the unresolved fearful style for adults, which is associated with an early childhood type of insecure, disorganized. And this is where, if you recall, in the early childhood experience of having a conflicted and disoriented behavior in relation to a caregiver who's frightened because they're maybe experiencing abuse, or frightening where they're abusive, can translate into a desperate and ineffective attempts to regulate the anxiety that comes up through approach and avoidance. So this pattern of not having a good coherent behavioral pattern in relationships, and efforts to deal with feelings of anxiety by both approaching and avoiding, but in a way that often doesn't work. So the internal working model for the unresolved or fearful adult pattern is around a negative view of the other and a negative view of the self. So that kind of lack of trust, and that can manifest in these different ways of being unassertive or introverted, feeling exploited by relationships, lacking self-confidence, or feeling very self-conscious with a partner, being depressed or anxious, hostile, or even violent in a relationship, having self-defeating behaviors, reporting physical illness, which is called somatic, a kind of somatic thing where people are feeling physically ill in relation to mental health kind of status, and then a fluctuation between a clinging and a withdrawing, which again is that ineffectual pattern around sort of approach and withdrawal that didn't work in the early childhood experience. So again, people are different. You can't say that there's a cookie cutter way anyone's going to turn out, but these are some patterns that have been observed in research in relation to the adult attachment styles that are determined through the adult attachment interview, ideally, and how there tend to be sort of patterns, particularly in romantic relationships. And then finally around, it's not just the romantic partnerships where attachment manifests, it's also in relation to parenting. So the kind of attachment style that is determined in an adult, there's a very high overlap with his or her own infant's attachment type to that parent. So the attachment status, or the state of mind regarding attachment of the parent, again, there seems to be a direct effect and a very high correlation between the attachment style of the parent and the attachment type of the infant, and research studies have shown as high as 75% predictability. So again, where you're going to see a difference in someone's attachment style is where they've been really thoughtful and if they want to change and are aware of the patterns from their early childhood, that's where you may see someone getting out of the pattern. But otherwise, the pattern that comes from one's own parenting as an early childhood can be transmitted to the next generation. So there can be this cycle of a certain way of relating. So secure adults tend to have security and gender security in their children, and their children tend to show a secure attachment type. Dismissing adults tend to engender avoidant relationships with their children, again, because they may be acting in a way that's rejecting or dismissive, not relating, not responding consistently to the child. Preoccupied adults tend to engender ambivalent attachment in their children, where they're, again, that kind of hot and cold inconsistency. And then adults with unresolved trauma or disorganized style may act in a way that's frightening or confusing with their children, or they may be abusive and may be frightening, which can cause disorganized attachment in their children. So there is a high relationship, a high correlation between one's own parenting, one's attachment style as an adult and one's child's attachment type. And finally, to conclude, why might this be? So in early childhood, we are learning through our early attachment relationship how to love. And it becomes something that becomes a pattern and a way of being that we're not conscious of. So it's like riding a bike or driving a car. It's just something that's sort of automatic. And these ingrained ways of being, ways of thinking and acting and behaviors tend to repeat themselves unless something has happened to actually change those patterns, which in many cases will be someone intentionally, engaging in psychotherapy, for example, to look at their patterns. So, when we're thinking about adult attachment, the things that come up are, am I the kind of person that others are likely to respond to? Are others likely to respond to me? That view of self or other, the internal working model. How do I regulate my emotions? And when in distress, do I seek proximity or do I avoid? So is there an attempt to kind of use a secure base and a safe haven in times of distress? So we're going to stop it here for young adulthood, and this concludes our lectures for week 10.